Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to News Dose, and the meaning of what a game console is seems to be changing. You know, we are seeing a bit of a migration in the AAA space right now, but not necessarily in the direction that console makers want it to be in. They've ultimately failed to attract new customers. And this is actually a big problem for them because of how they've positioned their businesses. Now, I think that's fairly obvious when it comes to Xbox, and that's one of the main reasons we're seeing such a drastic shift from them right now. They've declined since the Xbox 360 era. But PlayStation, on the other hand, this isn't quite as obvious to a lot of fans, and today, I'm going to explain what's happening here and why people within the know are suddenly expecting another drastic shift for the game industry, including PlayStation and how they treat their very own games. Before we get started, though, I do want to thank my supporters on Patreon and on YouTube memberships. Thank you just so much for your support in everything that you do. You will receive this video through early access. Let's just go and get right into things, though, starting off with the Nintendo Switch, because, they just managed the most amazing comeback story in gaming history. I mean, if you go back and look at the Wii U, that thing sold, right around 14 million units or something like that, which makes it one of the worst performing mainstream consoles ever from a units sold standpoint. So to see them go from something like that to the Switch, which has now surpassed 150 million units sold worldwide, is nothing short of incredible. Nintendo just announced its new milestone, and this is only the third console to ever reach that coveted 150 million club. It joins the company of the Nintendo DS and the PlayStation 2. Now, there is that conversation about whether or not the Switch can eventually catch up to the PlayStation 2, which Sony announced last year sold 160 million units, and I think that there is actually still a chance that they could. I mean, that seems far out just because the Switch 2 will steal a lot of its thunder later this year, but I don't think Nintendo will stop selling the current Switch as is. Instead, I think they could position the Switch as a cheap alternative, and they could even slash the prices if they want. And because, it just has such a massive, timeless library of games, I think there is a chance that it will still be a popular device during the holiday period when parents are looking for a budget-friendly gift. Either which way, though, what Nintendo has done with the Switch this generation is nothing short of incredible, and just big congrats to them. They not only carved out their own space in the console market, but you can even argue that they set an example of how to handle the console business, which is a big, big topic for today. Oh, and yesterday we talked about Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Seems to be an early Game of the Year candidate with an 87 overall score on Metacritic. And now, to top things off, it also has the audience to back up its critical success. It just launched today, and fans have echoed its quality with a 93% approval rate on Steam. And it also already reached a peak high of 159,000 concurrent players on Steam. Now, this is on a Tuesday, which is noteworthy because there's actually a chance that it will climb even higher as we draw closer to the weekend when most gamers like to play games. Now, just for comparison's sake here, the first game reached a peak high of 96,000 concurrent players, which is honestly pretty incredible for a new IP at the time. Deliverance 2, though, is also tracking ahead of notable RPGs such as Dark Souls 3, The Witcher 3, and the recently released Dragon Age: The Veilguard. So I think this speaks to how much Kingdom Come's fan base has grown since 2018, and also I think this is another example of how much PC gaming has grown over the years. One thing that we've seen a lot these past few years is that PC games are breaking records, including their own on a regular cadence, which speaks volumes about that specific market's growth. Now, I point that out specifically because this leads us to our next topic. What is a game console? That seems like a pretty straightforward question. But what we're seeing is that PC gaming is kind of blurring the line of what a console actually is. Let me just ask you, would you consider the Steam Deck a console? Would you consider the ROG Ally a console? What about a new Steam machine? There's a lot of rumors flying around right now that Valve is currently working on a Steam machine to compete in the quote-unquote console market. Would you consider any of these devices consoles? Because technically, on paper, they're not. or at least in the way that we usually view them. These are all technically PCs with customized software to make them feel more like a console experience. The Steam Deck is a customized Linux-based machine that boots directly into Steam OS. It's a very console-like experience. Now, the ROG Ally, I'd say that isn't quite as seamless as the Steam Deck because it uses Windows instead, but they do have their own app that kind of attempts to make it feel like a console experience. Now, there's also a lot of rumors that Microsoft is going to tackle this exact problem with their own Xbox OS that will further blur the line of what a PC is. So much so that their next Xbox console might technically be a PC in disguise, but it will use Xbox OS over top of Windows. Now, the reason I'm bringing all this up is because PC gaming has kind of exploded over the last 10 years, while the console market, on the other hand, has become a little bit stagnant. And that's a bigger problem than what some people might initially realize. This is a problem for third parties, and it's also a problem for console manufacturers. Now, the reason for that is because game companies built their businesses to expect console growth. I mean, let me just say it this way. If you look at game budgets today compared to 10 years ago, you'll see that they've ballooned to really an outrageous degree. Now, we can partially blame that on inflation. I mean, everything is more expensive now. But the reality of the situation is that's not the only reason for these ballooning budgets. Game developers and publishers consciously chose to pump more money into their games. Otherwise, it wouldn't take 6+ years to make a AAA game. That is an insane amount of time to develop a game compared to just 10 years ago. So this is the number one reason that we're seeing all of these different game publishers flood over to PC. Whether that be Sega, Square Enix, Capcom, Xbox, and even PlayStation to a lesser degree, the PC market is a booming business that is still growing. I mean, we just saw that with Wukong last year. Look at what happened over in China and just how that market reacted to Wukong's release. Now, some of these game companies had the foresight to jump in early, but little by little, these companies can no longer ignore PC in the way that they used to. It's just too big of a market, and modern AAA games are just too expensive to make, not to support it. So that's ultimately the gist of what's happening in the console market right now. I see day in and day out where people come in and say, oh, well, PlayStation is doing great as one such example. You know, they've sold 60+ million PlayStation 5 consoles, so why should we say console manufacturers are in trouble? And okay, you're kind of right about that. That all sounds fantastic on paper. But the reality is that's not necessarily as good as it sounds. Yes, PlayStation, the PS5, is tracking similar to the PS4, albeit it's not selling quite as fast. And that's one of the most important things that people need to understand about this specific conversation. The big difference between this generation and last is that game development was significantly cheaper last generation for the PS4 compared to the PlayStation 5. That's why Sony isn't 100% satisfied with where the PS5 currently is. What happened is they built their business in a way that they expected growth generation over generation, which is not what they're currently seeing. And that's why this conversation keeps coming up, that the console business is going to drastically change, possibly within the near future. In fact, what sparked this conversation in the first place is Jason Schreier's response to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's Steam success. He said 2 takeaways here. 1, Steam has become a bright spot for many game makers as console sales have flattened. And number 2, console exclusives will become obsolete soon, especially for third-party publishers. I mean, like I said earlier, pretty much every game publisher is flooding to PC right now. We can clearly see that. Most Japanese companies started to do that late last generation. Honestly, Square Enix is a little bit late to the party here. But even PlayStation, this is the company that everybody views as a very aggressive, exclusive company. But even they are doing these staggered PC releases now. And Jason seems to believe that they will eventually change that in the future also. I mean, Xbox being the other big AAA console manufacturer, they've already been doing that since, 2017, 2018? And there's a chance that they could further blur the lines of what a console is with their next Xbox console or PC in disguise. But as for PlayStation, Jason seems to believe that Sony will stop doing console exclusives at some point as well. Now, personally, I'm not expecting all of this to happen this generation, but I could very much see them further integrating PC next generation for the PS6. I mean, unless they can somehow get their budgets under control, otherwise, there's just a lot of money in the PC market that, truthfully, Sony needs to support some of their bigger blockbuster games. If you look at something like Helldivers 2 as one such example, it had a ton of success on PC. So I'm sure Sony is already looking into this as we speak, but I think the big thing that Xbox and PlayStation will need to navigate is how they handle their subscription business. PC gaming doesn't force gamers to buy into a subscription to play online games like they do over on consoles. So, Xbox and PlayStation probably doesn't exactly like that idea. They make a lot of money with their subscriptions, and it theoretically will be harder to sell those subscriptions all while their games are available on PC as well. But even with all that said, I think there is a conversation about where console gaming is headed next and where it'll be, let's say, 10 years from now. There could be a lot of changes within that time, so let me know what you all think about all of this. Do you agree that console exclusives, including PlayStation, will be a thing of the past within the next, let's say, 10 years? Now, one last thing before we go, and because today has been all about multi-platform, of course, we know Xbox is going in that direction, and not just when it comes to PC. They're doing things in a very unorthodox way, and they're even supporting rival consoles, which is something that I don't expect PlayStation to do anytime soon. Last week, Xbox announced Forza Horizon 5 for the PlayStation 5, and today, they just announced Age of Mythology Retold and Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition will soon be available as well. Now, Mythology Retold will launch on March 4th, whereas Age 2 will launch sometime this spring. Both will come with all of their expansions, which is really nice to see, and I think both of these ports, I think they make a lot of sense for Xbox. When the rumors first popped up last year that they were going to support rival consoles, honestly, Age is one of the first franchises that I immediately thought about because, they're not particularly all that big on consoles per se. These are much more PC-centric games, and because they put a lot of time into the console versions and just getting them to work over there, I think PlayStation will go a long way in making that extra work worth it for them. Now, I do expect these games to be announced for the Switch 2 at a later date. I do 100% expect a lot of Xbox game announcements at that April Direct, but like I said, I think this here is the right move for Xbox. Let's go take a look at the poll of the day, though, where I asked you all, do you think Xbox will do timed exclusives with most of their Xbox Game Studios published games, or do you expect day-and-date multi-platform with their games going forward? Now, most of you are expecting time exclusivity, which, so far it seems like that's kind of their plan. It seems like they'll still position at least some of their games as timed exclusives to keep their user base invested into their ecosystem, which is important for Xbox Game Pass. But, it also feels like their strategy is constantly just ever-changing. So it's definitely an unraveling mystery, but I think by this point next year, we will have a better idea as to how they want to go about this new-found strategy. Anyways, though, that's going to be it for this episode, but until next time, make sure to subscribe, ring that bell, and peace out.